for Russian publications. Here is a short overview of my CV, and it shows that I have been working at the Center for Science and Technology Studies in Leiden University for almost 30 years. I've been a senior scientific advisor at Elsevier, and I retired in 2014. And currently I'm a scientific advisor to the SCIMAGO research group, and I'm the editor-in-chief of a journal, Scholarly Assessment Reports, about which I will speak at the end of this lecture. This is an overview of the contents. First, I will speak about journal impact measures in general and focus very strongly upon the problem of the so-called subject field normalizations. Next, I speak about predatory journals and also what I would term as predatory journal metrics. Next, I speak about national versus international journals, and here I already look specifically at Russian domestic journals. And finally, I will discuss trends in the Russian publication output indexed in Scopus. And last but not least, I will speak about evaluative frameworks, and I will explain very well what I mean with that. Now let me start with the introduction about journal metrics. First of all, we have journal citation impact measures. There are many of them, and there is the journal impact factor, there's the SNP, the SJR, there's the H5, there's the eigenfactor. There are many more actually. And one of the important problems with journal metrics is that there appear to be large differences in citation practices among subject fields. And I will talk about this in the next part of the lecture. Also, it is a matter of concern that the distribution of citations among articles in a journal tends to be very skewed, and also that the paper's actual citation impact is not very well predicted by an average journal impact factor. A second group of metrics relates to the geographical spread of editors, authors, and readers. And in my lecture, in one of the next parts, I will speak about one particular measure, the measure of national orientation, which is defined as the percentage of articles in a journal from a country that accounts for the largest numbers of papers in a journal. And I will give more examples later on. Then there are also metrics related to the extent to which a journal is indexed in international databases. And the point that I will make later is that international databases may index national low-impact journals as well, and that the coverage can be partial or biased. A next group of metrics relates to usage or full text downloads from repositories or publishers' website. And there's a lot to be discussed about usage indicators, and perhaps a very important one is that downloading of reading is a private act, not a public act. And we have to keep that in mind always. And I think it would be very interesting that we work more in our field of library and information science about mathematical modeling of the relationship between downloads and citations. Then we have, of course, indicators of the visibility in social media. And I think there is a general impression in our field that those indicators, they tend to measure public interest, not so much scholarly merit. And then last but not least, there are indicators of the quality of the peer review system of a journal. And what I would like to promote actually is that we do a lot of more analysis of the peer review reports using computational linguistic methodologies. I think that can teach us a lot about the quality of peer review, and it can also give us tools to improve the peer review process. So this was my overview, and now I will start with the first part that relates to subject field normalizations in journal impact measures. Now let me start with something that probably we are all familiar with. That is the definition of the journal impact factor by Clarivate, I should say now, formerly Thomson Reuters and formerly Institute for Scientific Information. I think we are all familiar with this definition. I would like to underline that this journal impact factor basically relates to citations in a given year to articles published in the 2 preceding years. But there are also journal impact factors or measures that use 3 preceding years rather than 2 preceding years. And typical examples are the site score indicator in Scopus, but also the SNP, about which I will talk later, or the Scimago journal rank indicator. They all are based on citations to articles in 3 rather than 2 preceding years. But from a statistical point of view, there's not much difference between the standard one and this one based on 3 preceding years. Now, citation practices vary strongly among subject fields. Here I show you, for a range of subject fields identified in Scopus, the average value of the journal's impact factors that are covered by the various subject fields. For instance, for immunology, we see that the average journal impact factor is between 3 and 3.5, whereas in the humanities it's less than 0.5, and for mathematics it is between 1.0 and 1.5. So these are large differences, and there is a certain practice of people who are claiming that in the assessment of research performance and even the assessment of journals, it is sufficient to look at the journals that have an impact factor above 1. So roughly speaking, the idea is only the journals that have an impact factor above 1 are those that do have a substantial value. Now this assumption is entirely indefensible, as I will show in the next slides. There are 2 alternative approaches to the assessment of journal impact, and the first is to use so-called quartiles per subject field. And it works as follows. If I have a journal category and the journals are ranked actually by the impact factor,
66.
Then we can identify the top and the bottom of the list. That's not too difficult. We can identify the median, the first quartile, and the third quartile. And then we can distribute all journals in the category into 4 classes: the Q1, the first quartile, the second quartile, the third, and the fourth. And the first quartile contains the so-called top journals, whereas the fourth quartile contains the so-called bottom journals. I should make a few comments. A typical example of this use of quartiles can be found in the presentation of the Scimago journal rank, I must note that sometimes the top quartile is indicated with Q4 and the bottom with Q1, contrary to what I show on this slide. The notion of quartiles can be generalized to the calculation of rank percentiles. It should be noted, it's obvious, that absolute differences among journals are not considered in this approach. And perhaps the main limitation is that it must be based on a categorization of journals into subject categories. And that is a very difficult task to do that in a proper manner, especially the categorization of multidisciplinary journals. Then you have the problem of overlapping categories. This is especially true for the journal groups included in Scopus. And of course, there are differences in the number of journals among categories. You have big categories with many journals and very small categories with only a few journals. A second approach relates to directly compensating in the indicator itself for differences in citation potential among subject fields. And how can this be done? It can be done as follows. Let's take as an example the field of molecular biology. And here we have reference lists in papers published in journals covered by this field. And we compare that, for instance, with journals in the field of mathematics. Then we see that the length of the reference list in mathematics is much shorter than that in molecular biology. And that has immediate consequences for the citation levels in these fields. Because in molecular biology, we see a distribution of citations among papers that have a shape similar to what I show in this slide. And in this particular example, the mean value of the citations in the journal is close to 3.0. But in mathematics, in which the reference lists are so much shorter, the shape of the distribution of citations among papers is very different from the one you find in molecular biology. And actually you see that a large percentage of papers is not cited at all in the citation window applied. And the mean is in this case even a little bit lower than 1. So this slide aims to illustrate that citation potential in terms of the length of reference lists in papers in a subject field directly determine the overall level of citations that are obtained by papers in these subject fields. And you can calculate an indicator that compensates for these differences in citation potential. And one of them is the so-called SNP, the source normalized impact per paper. It's essentially a ratio of the journal impact factor and the citation potential in a journal subject field. And the citation potential, again, is determined by the length of the reference lists in a field. And what is very important, a journal subject field is defined as the set of all articles citing a particular journal. So we do not have an a priori list of journals per category, but we have a tailor-made definition of a subject field for each journal, including, by the way, a multidisciplinary journal. More info can be found on the website indicated on this line. Sorry. But I must mention that for the SNP values that are included in Scopus and also on the CWTS website, for about 5 to 10% of journals, these SNP values are actually unavailable. They are missing. And that, of course, is a limitation. Now, this slide shows the effect of the use of the SNP instead of the journal impact factor itself, because you can see now that on average, the journal impact as measured by the SNP is 1.0 in all subject fields. So this actually illustrates how the SNP indicator corrects for differences in citation potential among subject fields. Conclusions: there is no perfect journal metric, but never use the Clarivate Journal Impact Factor or Scopus Site Score or Google Scholar H5 for directly comparing journals from different subject fields. Categorizing per subject fields journals by quartile or percentile and compare quartiles is better, but it has a limitation too, because it uses an a priori journal subject classification. Next, also the so-called relative citation rates that divide a journal's impact factor by the field citation average in the subject field uses such an a priori system of journal categories and has the same limitation. But SNP compensates for differences in citation potential and has a tailor-made field subject definition, but currently for quite a few journals, especially in social sciences and humanities, SNP values are actually missing. Again, as you can see, there are no perfect solutions. There is no perfect indicator. And we must be aware of the limitations of an indicator in order to be able to use it in a proper manner. Now I come to part 2, predatory journals and predatory journal metrics. Now look at this slide that includes a few images from a site that is indicated on top of this slide, and it presents ISI impact factors for quite a few journals. As you can see, the journal here on top is the Journal of Commerce and Management Thought. It has a very impressive acronym, as you can see, and the impact factor is actually expressed in 3 digits. So this sounds as a very solid site, but I can assure you it's all fake. These journals may exist, but they are certainly not covered by Clarivate's Web of Science, and there is no ISI impact factor available at all for these journals. So this is a problem, and it's not only with this site. Here I have a rather frightening slide that shows you a list of at least some 15 or so other sites with impact factors of dubious validity. So there is a practice now of creating these sites and of promoting these fake, invalid journal metrics. I would like to show you a result of a study we are currently conducting, which relates to the so-called Beale list of potential, possible, or probable predatory scholarly open access publishers or journals. As you know, probably many of you know, the Beale list was actually published in 2016 or so, and it had an impact, but we do not know so much yet as to how big that impact actually was. And with the people from the Simago research group, we are conducting now a study aim to examine the effects or the possible effects of this B list upon the number of articles published by journals in that list. And here we see a typical example of two journals for which actually the number of published articles increased up until 2016, and after 2016 declined dramatically. And this suggests a potential effect of actually this B list upon the performance of these journals. But this is only a case study of two journals, and we of course want to examine many more journals. Conclusions and comments. I have shown that we do not merely have now predatory journals, but also predatory journal metrics. For instance, impact factors or usage counts. We should be aware of this and use only authoritative sources. And we should develop some kind of an informametric intuition to assess metrics. And many librarians actually have that. But perhaps we should look for ways to make that all, or many more people at least, have this intuition. For instance, if you see a journal site with a journal publishing, say, 10 papers a year or so, and claiming that there are 200,000 full-text downloads of that journal, and I have detected websites in which this actually happens, then you must hear alarm bells ringing, because it is highly improbable that this number of 200,000 usage downloads is actually correct. I should also make sure that you understand that there is no sharp borderline between predatory and non-predatory metrics in general. And some perhaps non-predatory metrics do have at least some predatory characteristics. And last but not least, the B list is very much focusing on open access journals, as you could see on the title of the previous slide. But I want to defend the position that what we need is an open, pluralistic publication system in which there is place both for open access and the so-called tall access journals. So I'm not very much in favor of promoting a system in which only one of these two types of journals is available. Maybe we can have a discussion about this issue also later after my presentation. Now I start with part 3 of the lecture, and that deals with national versus international journals. First, I would like to present an index of a journal's national orientation that we have been exploring in several papers. And it is defined as the percentage of a journal's publications published by authors from the country that has the largest number of publications in the journal. Now, let me give an example. An index value of 50% means that there is one country that accounts for or contributes to 50% of all articles published in a journal. Other measures are geographical distributions related to editors, reviewers, users or readers, and of course the status of impact of editors or topic internationality. But in this presentation and in some of the papers we have been publishing in the past year, we explore this index of national orientation. And we apply a threshold value of 50% or even of 80%. but the outcomes of the analysis are not very sensitive to where precisely this threshold is being laid. So 50% or 80% gives more or less the same results. Now, here I show a graph that displays the number of publications in 3 types of journals. First of all, the so-called domestic journals. These are journals in which Russian authors account for at least 50% of the papers. Then we have foreign national journals. These are journals in which there is indeed a country accounting for 50% or more of the papers, but it's not Russia. It's another country, for instance, the USA. And finally, the complement of these 2 classes is labeled here as international journals. And what you can see is that in the case of Russia, that is to say, of papers published by authors with affiliations in Russia, we see a strong increase of especially the number of international journal papers, but also that of domestic national journal papers. And this gives an impression of the absolute numbers. Perhaps it is more informative to look at percentages, and that is taking place in the current slide. And here we see actually that up until 2012 or so, the percentage of papers in domestic, that is Russian national journals, actually increased, but after 2012 it declined and reached in 2019 a level below that of the percentage of papers in international journals. I would like to present results from more recent studies and some conclusions. I first would like to make clear that we have done studies in which we found that about 35% of national journals indexed in Scopus increased their citation impact significantly. And for Russian journals, this percentage amounts even to 70, which is twice as much as we found for all national journals in Scopus. Sorry. Next, we found that the overall impact level of national journals at the end of the time period is still modest, and that of Russian national journals even somewhat below this overall level. So the trends in the citation impact of national journals is something of the question whether in a bottle with 50% of content is half full or half empty. The results are positive because they indeed show that national journals do increase their impact when they are processed for Scopus. On the other hand, it shows that the process of gaining impact is slow and there is still a long way to go. Should also note that being indexed in an international citation index does not necessarily mean that a journal has many international authors or a high citation impact. And this should be kept in mind when using publishing in journals indexed in international databases as a criterion of research performance of individuals or institutions in a particular country. I also want to underline that the publication practices and also the extent to which authors publish in national journals is influenced by a range of factors. You have publishing traditions, you have political, historical, and geographical factors, and last but not least, you also have, of course, factors related to the criteria that are being used in research, assessment, and funding practices in a particular country. And the results that I'm presenting now were published in 2 papers, of which you can see the details in the last 2 bullets of this slide. Now I come to part 4, which relates to trends in Russian publication output indexed in Scopus. Now this is a very interesting subject. I would like to start with presenting the findings of a study that was conducted almost 20 years ago. And that relates to Australia. It was conducted by my colleague Linda Butler. And what I want to underline from this study is the following result. The author assessed the citation impact of the journals in which Australian researchers published between 1981 and 1997 or so. And that is labeled as relative journal impact on this slide. And what you can see is that the relative journal impact of the publications of Australian researchers showed a quite dramatic decline over these 2 decades, and especially became low as from 1991. And that was actually the year in which Australia started a new way of funding research, and they used a funding formula in which the number of publications in journals processed for or indexed for the Web of Science, or the Science Citation Index then, played an important role. So what do you see? What was the message? The message was, yes, Australians do publish more in journals processed for the Web of Science, but the impact of the journals in which they publish is actually considerably declining. And this was really considered to be a significant outcome, and it raises questions about the effects of this type of use of funding formula in the funding of research in this particular country. Now, I was just wondering, how did this trend develop in Russia? And I want to show you some results of this analysis, and it was conducted using a slightly different methodology, but I think still a valid one. This is the first result. What we did was we used the SNP indicator because it compensates for differences in citation practices among subject fields, and we also used a categorizations of journals into quartiles. So we have Q1, which indicates the set of journals for which the SNP has the highest value. So it is the top quartile of journals in terms of SNP value. And Q4 is the bottom quartile of journals in terms of their SNP citation impact. And what we can see in absolute terms is that there is a very strong increase of Russian publications made in journals in the Q2 and Q3 SNP quartiles, but also some increase in the number of papers in journals in the top quartile as well. Now we look at the percentages rather than at the absolute numbers, and we see again a relative increase in the papers published in Q2 and Q3 journals, but now you can see more clearly that there is, during the entire period between 1999 and 2019, a very strong decline in the percentage of papers in the so-called Q4 or bottom impact journals, which is a very interesting result. Please note that there are considerable percentages of publications in journals for which we do not have SNP values. And that is, again, a limitation of this analysis. But I hope it is not too disturbing, at least for some disciplines, as I will show later, and at least for years after, say, 2006. This is a result for all papers taken together from all disciplines, but I have some results per discipline too, and that's very relevant because there appear to be large differences between disciplines. Here I show the results for biomedical research, and here we note a large percentage of papers in the Q4 or bottom quality quartile. And it fluctuates, but it's more or less around a more steady level of, say, 40% or so. Clinical medicine has a similar pattern. I will not show the slide. But in engineering and also in natural sciences, the pattern is entirely different, as you can see here. There is a large increase in the share of Q2 and, an increase in the share of articles in Q2 and Q3 journals, and a very steep decline of papers in journals that are in the bottom quartile. Finally, for social sciences and humanities, first of all, you should note that the percentage of papers for which the SNP values are missing is very high indeed and fluctuates also across the years. So this makes the outcomes a little bit unstable. I'm sorry about that. But you can see in any case that also in this discipline, the share of papers in the bottom quality journals is really declining. And that in the Q2 and the Q3 journals is increasing. So these are the results per discipline. As regards the interpretation of these outcomes, that is a very difficult issue. I'm not an expert in this at all because I am not an expert in how the science system in Russia, and especially how the research assessment methodologies and the funding mechanisms in Russia have developed over the years. I'm sure that among the audience there will be many people who are experts in that, and I hope that they find my results interesting and that they will come up with very valid and useful interpretations of the data. Finally, let me discuss very briefly in the time that is remaining, a few minutes, something about the notion of an evaluative framework and about the overall limitations of the use of metrics in the assessment of journal performance and especially in the assessment of research performance. An evaluative framework is very important because it determines, it specifies the norms or the values that are relevant, and it defines the norms that have to be taken into account in an assessment. Bibliometrics or any assessment assumes a set of norms or values that have to be assessed. And the validity of those norms of values cannot be founded in bibliometric or informametric research, but must come from elsewhere, from some kind of an evaluative view of what performance is and how it should be measured. Now, talking about assessing journals, I think it's essential that we realize that you should consider a journal's scope, function, and target audience, and you have to take that into account. And from that, these assumptions or these starting points, you can derive which indicators should be used and which indicators cannot be used. For instance, you have journals that are focused on the international research front, but also journals that are more nationally oriented. You have journals that are really focusing on the research front, but also journals that focus on practitioners, those who use results from that front, and even journals that are directed towards the wider public. And you have journals that publish on international topics, but you also have journals that publish on local topics. Now, you cannot claim a priori that only the international journals are important, or that only communication to international researchers are important. For instance, especially in larger countries, you need also journals to transfer the knowledge from the international front to practitioners, for instance, medical doctors or engineers. Those journals are useful, they should be there. But assessing them on the basis of, say, international impact measures would not be appropriate. I also think that it is, talking about journal quality, it is important, I mentioned this already, but I want to underline it, to assess the peer review system in more detail, and also to analyze status of editorial review board members, and especially analyze these peer review reports that could eventually result in more direct indicators of journal quality. Sometimes people seem to assume that there is a one-to-one, almost perfect correlations between journal impact factors and journal quality. But that is probably not the case. And in any case, if you want to examine that, you would need other, more independent indicators of journal quality. And then the quality of the peer review system could be a very useful indicator. This is why we should work on it. I also want to mention, I think I still have some time left, that, for instance, in Spain, there is a special agency that assesses national journals and tries to improve those journals. And it is a public agency, actually. And it uses a series of methods and several indicators, and has also many direct interviews or contacts with the publishers and the editors of these journals. And one of the things that this organization does is that it requires publishers and editors to show a large number of peer review reports, because that enables the members of this organization to have a more founded impression of the quality of the peer review process. Then, I said it already, but I want to underline it, indicators depend upon the scope, function, and audience of the journal. So for national journals, subscriptions can be useful, and also quality of peer review, and perhaps even of the status of those who are responsible to translate or to transfer results from the international front to the national front. But impact factors as such do not seem to have very much value. Whereas for international journals, impact quartiles, or at least field normalized measures, or more information on the distribution of the countries of the authors who publish in the journal, or the authors who are citing the journal, could be useful. But again, it all depends upon the scope of the journal. It's also important, I think, to consider the wider national publication and research system. The phase of scientific development of a country is very important. I would like to give you one particular example, and that is on international scientific collaboration. A large degree of papers with in international collaboration can be a sign of strength if the journal has really developed a proper research system and is actually further developing it. But it can also be a sign of weakness, because it means that research in a country is very much dependent upon the research abroad. So there is not a simple, direct interpretation of a bibliometric indicator, and you must take into account the phase of scientific development. You should also take into account that you have large countries and small countries. And some countries are very big and they have a national publishing industry. And the smaller countries normally do not have that industry. So they publish more in international journals. This is, for instance, true especially for the smaller European countries like, indeed, the Netherlands or Sweden or Denmark and so on. I have to hurry up because it's almost time. These are points that we can discuss further, but that are very important to keep in mind. I certainly do not want to promote the idea that journal impact factors are have a general applicability and are decisive in all assessments of journals or researchers. That is complete nonsense, and I hope to have shown to you and to have argued in a convincing manner that it very much depends upon the scope, function of audience of journal and of the criteria of quality that are being applied and funded in a funding system, which indicators you actually use. Last but not least, I wanted to mention to you that with a group of active co-editors, we have founded a new journal with the title Scholarly Assessment Reports. And I want to mention it here to you because it has a special characteristic. It's not a technical informatic or bibliometric journal, because we have many good journals already, but it is aimed to a wide scholarly and policy audience. And it actually aims to transfer notions and policy relevant results from our field of bibliometrics and informatics to a wider group of interested scholars and policy officials. And the journal is now 1 year old, and we plan to further develop it, and we hope that you are interested in it. This ends my lecture. I want to thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Henk. Are you online? Are you with us?
Yes, I am. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Hello. And of course, there are also the people in the audience and in the Zoom. And I would like to thank you for the presentation. And I would like to ask whether there are any questions in the audience. уважаемые коллеги, если есть вопросы к разработчику метрики СНИП и, соответственно, в целом к ведущему наукометристу, пожалуйста, вы можете подойти, задать свои вопросы. Только, пожалуйста, отсюда, чтобы микрофон. Just a second, we have a question, and the person is coming. Так, сейчас, секунду. Ну, здесь у нас перевод есть, я думаю, что можно и на русском.
Так, да, добрый день, большое спасибо за доклад, за лекцию. У меня вопрос следующий. Мы в университете сейчас все чаще для оценки в рамках Scopus используем Quartiles СНИП. Раньше чаще использовали Quartiles по SGR. И вот интуитивно кажется, что Quartiles СНИП и Quartiles по SGR должны быть довольно похожи и совпадать в большинстве случаев. Но чаще всего это не так. Вот в чем заключается различие, в чем их причина?
Well, I did not understand. Do you compare the SNP with which other indicator? I didn't hear that.
Do you have SGR?
The SGR, the SIMAGO. Well, the SIMAGO indicator, you know how it is constructed. It aims to take into account the status of the citation, of the citing journal. And it is true that also the SGR indicator, so say the mathematical model that is behind it, makes sure that there is some correction for differences among research fields, also in the calculation of the SGR. Nevertheless, if you compare, for instance, the SGR with the standard Thomson impact factor, and you do that also for the SNP compared to the standard impact factor, then you will see, at least that is what I have seen when I did this analysis, that the SGR is much more biased for the larger and the high impact journals. So essentially it makes the differences between journals much bigger than SNP. SNP is more, say, favorable for the smaller and the lower impact journals, whereas the SGR amplifies, in a sense, the status and the citation impact of the big journals. So it's up to you what you find the most important characteristic in the assessment of the journal that you are conducting. If you believe that it is important to take into account where the citation comes from, then it's better to use the SGR, or perhaps even the eigenfactor that is built on a more or less similar mathematical model. But if you are very much focusing on these differences in the frequency at which people cite each other, then it is probably better to use the SNP. So in the case of the SNP, what you see is that the journals in fields that have a relatively low impact factor, the SNP value goes up compared to other journals. And for SGR, again, you see the same phenomenon, but then it is especially for the big high impact journals. That is my view, at least. Maybe the SIMAGO people, like my good friend Felix Moya, would have a different view, but this is the experience that I've had. I hope it is clear what I'm trying to say.
Все, большое спасибо. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Hank. Dear colleagues in the Zoom, if you have any questions, please, you also have the opportunity to ask them. Well, we have also a question from the audience. Just a second.
Добрый день, спасибо за интересный доклад. У меня очень простой вопрос. Вот вы сказали, SkyMaga, SGR уже вывесили рейтинг, а когда в этом году СНИП вывесят? Обычно аж в конце месяца было, а сейчас что-то нет.
Well, there is, I think the next speaker is from Elsevier. Maybe he knows this better. I'm not working with Elsevier anymore. I think that as a rule, the new SNP is published actually in May or June of a particular year. And maybe they are late. I don't know what the implications are. What I can say is that when I was still with Elsevier, we experimented with calculating a SNP every 6 months, not every year, but every 6 months. And that would logically is possible and technically feasible, but it has never got off the ground. So again, if you want to know specific technical reasons from the part of Elsevier, perhaps, why there is this delay, then you should ask them. I'm afraid I can't help you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Hank. Indeed, it's
I see
more to me because I'm working in Elsevier, and indeed there is a slight delay.
May I make
Be sure it will be launched very soon.
I just saw a message.
It's not really delayed.
Well,